Hello, this is Tim Congdon, Chair of the Institute of International Monetary Research at the University of Buckingham. It's November 2023, and in this discussion of global monetary and financial trends, I want again to look at the American public debt and the potential crisis because of its rapid growth. Now, last month I covered this topic, and there was a great deal of interest in what I was saying. In fact, there were 10 times as many views of the video as usual. So I think it's worth elaborating on this subject in a bit more detail. Obviously, America has got a high ratio of public debt to GDP at present, and it's rising fast. And some of the debt is owned by foreigners. And one of the issues here is whether these creditors, these foreign creditors, could at some date, way out in the future of course, but could kind of demand a ransom from the USA for buying or renewing the debt. And that's what I want to consider today. Obviously, this would have major implications for the USA's international position, role and power. And this is one of the things that was noticed indeed by Larry Summers in his 18th of September talk to a think tank in Washington. He said that the growth of the debt, the possibility of deficits some years out into the double digits as a share of GDP could affect the international reputation of the USA, and he asked how long can or will the world's greatest debtor be able to maintain its position as the world's greatest power. Just to return to the subject of the size of the debt and what's going on, this is the ratio of federal debt to GDP in the USA since the mid-1960s. You can see it was rising in the 1980s, then came under control in the 1990s with the Clinton presidency. And then we've had these two upward blips, one in connection with the Great Recession of 2008 to 10, and the other more recently because of COVID. And I think what many people have been shocked and surprised by is that under the Biden presidency, although you can see that blip coming down at the end, that's just misleading because of the recovery of GDP as COVID came to an end. In fact, the trend of debt to GDP is upwards for some decades on unchanged policies. And the Congressional Budget Office in late 2020 actually did a kind of picture of what expected to happen. This, let me emphasize, is the Congressional Budget Office. This isn't some cranks. And they suggested that the ratio of debt to GDP might reach 230% by 2050. 230% by 2050. This is completely out of line with anything in the past. And it's much higher, for example, than at the end of the Second World War, when the ratio of debt to GDP was more like 100%. So we need to ask about what's going on here, and one of the aspects of all this that I think needs to be emphasized is that the debt's got to be serviced, interest has to be paid on the debt, and the higher that the debt goes, higher the rate of interest on the debt, of course, the ratio of debt interest to GDP takes off. Many people are expecting the debt to GDP ratio to get up to about 140% by the end of this decade. The interest on 10-year US Treasuries was, the yield was 5% a few weeks ago. It's 4.5% at the moment. Suppose that 4.5% were to continue and the debt to GDP ratio does reach 140%, then debt interest to GDP would be over 6%, and that would be the highest in modern American history. But that's not the end of it, because the interest is itself part of public spending. As public spending goes up, because of the higher debt interest bill, that widens the budget deficit. That then increases the debt. That increases the debt interest. And you get this risk of a self-feeding and even a self-reinforcing kind of vicious spiral downwards into indebtedness, etc. Indebtedness and what, you might ask. We'll come on to that in a second. Of course, if the interest rate were these kind of numbers and, say, bond yields of 5%, 7%, and the debt to GDP ratio were 230%, as forecast by the CPO, then the debt interest to GDP ratio moves up to 11.5% to 16% of GDP. I mean, it's all hypothetical, and frankly, I don't think it could ever really happen, but one needs to be aware of just simply the laws of arithmetic in this subject. Larry Summers talked about the deficit to GDP ratio in the USA in double digits in coming years. I'm sorry, that simply cannot happen, because you will soon get into this kind of situation. I think the constraint here is the ratio of debt interest to GDP, not debt to GDP. And I've looked some of the numbers in different countries, different periods, and I can't find any example of the debt interest to GDP ratio going above 15%, except for a year or two, usually of social trauma and crisis. So this seems to be more fundamental than the Reinhardt and Rogoff proposal back in their 2011 book, that the limit, there's some kind of tipping point at 90% of GDP. You have had countries, including the UK, including Japan at the moment, where debt to GDP the debt's been twice GDP, but it's perfectly okay because interest rates are lower, and the debt interest to GDP ratio has been 5, 6, 7%, which is possible. Just now to bring us back to where we currently are. This is all numbers one needs to be aware about, thinking about for the future. At present, the ratio of debt interest to GDP in the USA, this is the third quarter of 2023, is about 3.6%. That may seem all right. It's actually up about 50% from 2.4% in early 2021. It's still lower than in the late 1980s and early 1990s. We are probably going to get back up towards the numbers in the late 1980s, early 1990s on unchanged policies in the next 5 or 10 years. The real worry is if something isn't done. And obviously, at the moment, American politics is very partisan, it's polarized, and there's no discussion of the explosion in public debt in the presidential, sort of run-up to the presidential election next year. This is unlike 1992, when Bill Clinton highlighted the debt issue as something that the USA had to deal with. It's not like the situation 30 years ago, when the situation was much less serious, but it's much less discussed. And I'm going to tell some stories that are a little bit lurid, a little bit exaggerated, just simply to understand what's going on here. So let's just try and work out what happens when this kind of downward vicious spiral gets going. Let's first of all assume that the nation can't borrow from abroad. Okay, I'm talking about any nation, not just the United States, but okay. Now, everybody is aware that the public debt is growing rapidly. Everybody knows that there's growing payments of debt interest. And the question of fiscal sustainability is inescapable. So the cost of people worried about what's going on, they'll demand higher and higher interest to buy the government debt. That's obviously true for individuals, it's true for financial institutions who have some choice about what they can do. And so after a time, the cost of the issuing the debt becomes excessive. You get up towards this sort of 10 to 15% of GDP interest on the public debt, at which point you start to get into really big trouble. And then what the government does is to borrow from the banks. The banks are highly regulated anyway. They can't really argue back. And so the result of this is they borrow from the banks issue money, the rate of money growth takes off, you get inflation, maybe moderate at the start, then it's galloping inflation over 50% a month, and then there's hyperinflation. Okay. This may all sound a little bit hypothetical, over the top, etc., etc. Let's be clear, there have been dozens and dozens of hyperinflations in the past. And even though everybody who knows understands the basic processes at work. The government might try to borrow from the commercial banks. And one of the devices here is to require the banks to hold high cash reserves. Government then, central bank then pays no interest on the cash reserves. It's a kind of tax. You might think that this is, again, exaggerated. This discussion a discussion about this is underway at the moment, academic discussion in the Eurozone, all right? It's to deal with the problems that Eurozone governments have. That's already started. Alternatively, the government may insist that the banks hold 20, 30, 40, 50% of their assets in government bonds. That again is quite common around the world. Okay, so that's government borrowing from the commercial banks. There's then in the extreme government borrowing from the central bank, which creates new notes, so money printing, or they borrow again from the central bank, which creates new cash reserves for the banks, and then the banks grow their balance sheets by a multiple of that. And now look, obviously these things are extreme. All I'm saying is that, you can't have the American public debt reaching 160, 170, 180% of GDP. It just isn't. You'll then start to get into these kind of issues and problems. And we've gone, to be clear, from 60% at the end of the 1980s. Clinton was worried about it, came back down to 50%. It's now at 120% and rising fast. All right? We are heading for 140%. Okay. Now then, in this so far, I've been assuming no foreign borrowing. All right. Assume that there can be some foreign borrowing. Now, in Latin America in the 1970s and 80s, governments knew they had no credibility with domestic savers. So they went to the international banking system. The banking system thought these international banks, American banks, European banks and so on, Japanese banks, thought they could enforce the claims on the Latin American governments under international law, and they did indeed do so. And therefore, the governments had the ability to borrow from abroad on a large scale. But of course, when things get difficult, the foreign creditors can impose conditions. And that affects the sovereignty of the nations concerned. The foreign creditors, in the extreme, can demand ransoms in the form of ever higher interest rates and so on. So borrowing abroad isn't a soft option in the end. Okay, and of course the rather sorry history of Latin America in the 1990s, a lost decade as they sorted out the debt problems, is well known. That's by way of background. So once this process gets going, it is, as I said, self-feeding, self-reinforcing, and very vicious. These discussion may seem extraordinary to say these things about the United States. Well, there are examples, countless examples of these kind of problems all around the world in the last 50, 100 years. There are lots of examples of this kind. Just to conclude, I want to look at the composition of American public debt in the past and prospectively, to get a sense of the constraints that affect these processes that affect government's ability to borrow. There's some very good data around. We have information from the Federal Reserve about holders of American Treasury securities, most of the national debt, going back to 1945. I'm going to focus on 3 dates. I'm going to focus on 1945, when the debt after the Second World War was about GDP, with the same size as GDP. And then I'm going to look at 2010, just after the Great Recession. Then I'm going to look at the situation today. Now, in 1945, the debt was not quite as high as today relative to GDP, but it was historically one of the extremes. And you can see that at this point, the American public debt was hardly held at all by foreigners. Just only 1% of the debt was held abroad. How then did the USA finance the Second World War? Well, largely by borrowing from banks. There was rapid money growth. There was inflation after the Second World War, got up to 20% in 1947. But the situation was manageable, sustainable, and in the post-war period, the ratio of debt to GDP came down. But I think it's worth saying here that the American banking system resented the fact that it had to hold all this public debt because it meant it couldn't lend to the private sector and make profits on the assets that they'd normally have made. So right through in the 1960s, this was a bone of contention among the American banking community. Okay, well then we look on to 2010, and here we see a total transformation. Here, the foreign holdings of American public debt were almost 45% of the total. There were still, of course, domestic holdings. The banking system still held some of the American public debt, but it had come down to just over 16%. And this was in a way, the extreme time for foreign holdings of American debt. This was through the early years of the 21st century. Asian governments in particular were accumulating treasuries to establish their financial credentials again after the Asian crisis of the late 1990s. And China was one of the big holders of American debt in 2010, 2011, and so on. Now let's look at today. And you can see that the foreign share has come back to about 30%, down from 45% to 30%. And the big increase compared with 2010 has been the holdings of government securities by the American banking system, including the Federal Reserve. Yep, we've had some inflation in the last few years. I'm not forecasting inflation in the next year or two in the USA. Inflation is coming down, but this does illustrate the risk that if there is this monetization of debt with the banks holding more and more government debt, there's going to be an inflation risk in the future. And it's worth saying here, I think, that there is very little experience in the past of the US non-bank private sector. That's the financial institutions, the pension funds, the insurance companies. Sometimes there's direct holdings by the personal sector in companies, some holdings by state governments, but there's very little evidence of all those holdings together, the US non-bank private sector, going above 75% of GDP. So we're talking about, I'm afraid, about the debt reaching 140, 150, 160%, way out, well, maybe not that far out. The US non-bank private sector not wanting to hold more than, say, 3/4 of GDP. So the balance is to be held by banks and foreigners. This process has to be stopped. I mean, I don't know how it's going to be stopped, but, obviously the 2024 presidential election is not the kind of issue that it ought to be. I just finished by showing a chart of China's holdings of American public debt. They have been going down. China is in no position to demand a ransom to buy American government debt. However, let's just be clear that the choices facing the American government, if it keeps on letting this debt explode, are extremely unattractive. Thank you.